The alien huntress fired an arrow at him, but he caught it. Now, by sacred right, he is hers eternal. Imagine this. A man stranded on a savage jungle planet, his ship in ruins, his life hanging by a thread. Out of the shadows, she emerges, a towering alien huntress, her emerald skin glinting under a blood-red sky, her eyes burning with deadly intent. She draws her bow, an arrow screaming through the air, aimed straight for his heart. Death is seconds away, until, in a flash of defiance, he snatches it mid-flight, his hands trembling, blood dripping from his palm. But that's not the end. It's the beginning, because in that split-second act, he triggers an ancient ritual, a sacred rite no human could have foreseen. Now, she claims him, body and soul, bound to her forever in a bond forged by blood, danger, and something far darker. What happens when a lone treasure hunter becomes the prey of a warrior who doesn't let go? And what secrets lurk in the jungles of Xythera that could unravel them both? Stick around. This story's just getting started. If you're hooked already, and I hope you are, don't miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button on my YouTube channel. It's totally free, and you'll get every wild twist of this tale right as it drops. Let's dive into this adventure together. Tristan Varkes had never been one for safe bets. At 32, he'd carve out a life on the edge of the galaxy, a treasure hunter with a reputation for finding things others couldn't or wouldn't touch. He wasn't a hero, not by a long shot. His family had been smugglers, running guns and rare tech through the lawless fringes of the Vera system until a rival crew torched their operation. Parents dead, siblings scattered, Tristan inherited little more than a knack for survival and a beat-up ship called the Eclipse Runner. He'd turned that into a living, chasing whispers of lost artifacts across forgotten planets, selling them to the highest bidder on the black market. It wasn't noble, but it kept him moving, until 3 days ago, when it all went to hell. The pirates hit him hard. He'd been tracking a lead on an ancient power core, something rumored to predate human spaceflight, when their ship dropped out of hyperspace and opened fire. Plasma bolts shredded the Eclipse Runner's hull, frying the NAV systems and sending him spiraling toward an uncharted green on the scanner. Xythera, he'd later learn it was called, a jungle planet that didn't show up on any official charts. The crash was a blur of fire and noise, trees snapping like twigs as his ship plowed into the forest. He'd crawled out of the wreckage, bruised and bloody, with nothing but his dagger, a cracked wristband comm device, and a stubborn refusal to die. Now, on day 3, Tristan hacked his way through the jungle with grim determination. The air clung to him like a wet blanket, thick with humidity and the sour stench of decay. Towering trees stretched up 100 feet or more, their gnarled branches weaving a canopy so dense it choked out the sun, leaving only a faint, eerie green light to filter down. Roots twisted across the ground like giant snakes, slick with moss and dripping with moisture. Vines dangled everywhere, some thorned, some pulsing faintly as if alive. Every sound, rustling leaves, a distant screech, the snap of a twig, put him on edge. He gripped his dagger tighter, its blade glinting dully in the gloom. His jacket hung in tatters, the black fabric torn by thorns and soaked with sweat. His pants weren't much better, ripped at the knees, caked with reddish mud that smelled faintly of iron. 3 days, he muttered, slashing at a vine blocking his path. 3 damn days, and no sign of the ship. He'd been searching for wreckage. Anything salvageable, a power cell, a transmitter, something to get him off this rock. The crash site was a mess, scattered across miles of jungle, and he'd barely scratched the surface. His stomach growled, his throat burned from thirst, but he pushed on. Stopping meant giving up, and Tristan Varkes didn't give up. Not after surviving pirate ambushes, asteroid fields, or that nasty run-in with a debt collector on Calax Prime. He wiped sweat from his brow, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and squinted into the shadows. There's got to be something out here. The attack came without warning. A sharp whistle sliced through the humid air, and Tristan's instincts, honed by years of dodging trouble, kicked in. He twisted to the side, his body low, as an arrow streaked past his shoulder. It thunked into a tree trunk behind him, quivering, its shaft gleaming like polished steel. Son of a, he started, but the words died in his throat. Another whistle, closer this time. He spun, eyes wide, and saw it. An arrow, its tip wickedly sharp, hurtling straight for his chest. Time slowed to a crawl. His hand shot up, pure reflex, and somehow, impossibly, he caught it. His fingers closed around the shaft mid-flight, stopping it inches from his heart. The impact jolted him back, his boots skidding in the mud. He stared at the arrow, breathing hard, his pulse hammering in his ears. It was beautiful in a deadly way, crafted from some alien metal that shimmered faintly, etched with strange runes along the side. "What the hell is this?" he rasped, his voice hoarse. Before he could process it, a shadow moved in the jungle ahead. Leaves parted, and a figure stepped into view. She was tall, nearly 7 feet, maybe more, her presence filling the space like a storm rolling in. Her skin was a deep emerald green, catching the dim light in a way that made it glow, smooth and flawless despite the scars crisscrossing her arms. Her eyes burned red, bright and fierce, like twin flames cutting through the gloom. What he'd first taken for hair wasn't hair at all. Slender, wriggling tendrils spilled over her shoulders, curling and swaying like they had a mind of their own. They brushed against a chest barely covered by a leather harness. The material stretched tight over a powerful frame, leaving her midriff bare. Her legs were long and muscled, rooted to the ground in a stance that screamed predator. In her hands, she held a massive bow, its curve carved from dark wood, another arrow already notched and aimed. Tristan's mouth went dry. This wasn't human. This was something else, something dangerous. She hissed, a sharp, guttural sound that sent a shiver down his spine, and took a step closer. Her tendrils twitched, coiling tighter, and those red eyes locked onto him with an intensity that pinned him in place. "Hey, easy now," he called, raising one hand in a shaky gesture of peace, the arrow still clutched in the other. "I'm not here to fight. Just passing through." His voice sounded weak even to him, swallowed by the jungle's oppressive quiet. She didn't answer, at least not in a way he could understand. Her head tilted, those burning eyes narrowing as if sizing him up. Then, in a blur of motion, she moved. Faster than he could track, she yanked the bowstring back and fired again. This arrow came lower, aimed at his gut. Adrenaline surged, drowning out the ache in his limbs. He twisted, his free hand snapping out, and caught it barehanded this time. Pain flared as the edge sliced his palm, blood welling up and dripping onto the moss below. He gritted his teeth, holding both arrows now, his chest heaving. "You done yet?" he snapped, glaring at her. "Because I'm getting real tired of this." The alien froze. Her bow lowered an inch, her tendrils jerking like they'd been shocked. For a heartbeat, she just stared, her red eyes wide, something shifting behind them, surprise, maybe, or disbelief. Then in one fluid motion, she dropped to a knee, her bow clattering to the ground beside her. She pressed a clawed hand to her chest, right over her heart, and spoke a single word, "HFY." Her voice was low, rough, rolling over the syllables like they carried a weight he couldn't grasp. Tristan blinked, his grip tightening on the arrows. "What?" The cracked wristband on his arm buzzed to life, its translator kicking in with a faint static hum. The tech was half dead, scavenged from the Eclipse runner's wreckage, but it caught enough. Ritual, bound forever. His stomach dropped like a stone. "Wait, what?" he said again, louder this time, stepping back. She rose to her feet, towering over him, and took a step closer. Up close, he could see the details, the faint scars on her angular face, the way her harness hugged her body, accentuating every curve and muscle. She barked something sharp, pointing at the arrows in his hands, then at herself. The wristband hummed again. "You caught twice. HFY. So, mine." Tristan's jaw clenched. He just stumbled into something big, something he hadn't signed up for. This warrior, this creature, thought he belonged to her now, tied to her by some ancient rule he didn't understand. Her red eyes bored into him, fierce and unyielding. But there was something else there too, a flicker of frustration, maybe even anger. She wasn't happy about this either, he realized. "Look, lady," he said, keeping his voice steady despite the knot twisting in his gut. "I don't know what's going on, but I just want my ship. I crashed here, okay? I'm not looking to play soulmate with anyone." Her gaze didn't waver. She stepped closer still, her shadow swallowing him, and spoke again, slower this time. The tendrils on her head swayed with her words, brushing against her shoulders. The wristband crackled. "Bound forever. HFY." Tristan swallowed hard. Whatever he'd just done, catching those damn arrows, it had changed everything. And judging by the way she loomed over him, her presence radiating heat and danger, there was no walking away from it. Tristan stood there, arrows still in his bleeding hands, staring up at the towering alien who'd just declared him hers. The jungle hummed around them, chirps and rustles blending into a low, constant drone, but the air between them crackled with something heavier. Xythera, as he'd later learn her name, straightened to her full height, her emerald skin catching the faint green light filtering through the canopy. Her red eyes narrowed, pinning him like a bug under glass, and those wriggling tendrils on her head coiled tighter, like they were sizing him up too. He didn't like it. Not the way she looked at him, not the way his wristband kept buzzing with words like bound and forever, and definitely not the way his gut twisted when she stepped closer, her presence filling the space like a storm about to break. "Listen," he said, keeping his voice low and steady despite the ache in his sliced palm. "I don't know what this HFY thing is, but I'm not sticking around. I got a ship to find and a life to get back to. So how about we call this a misunderstanding and go our separate ways?" He held out the arrows, offering them back like they were hot coals he couldn't wait to ditch. She didn't take them. Instead, she barked something sharp in her guttural language, her clawed hand slashing through the air. The wristband hummed. "No leave. HFY stay." Tristan's jaw tightened. "Great," he muttered under his breath. "Just what I needed." Xythera turned abruptly, her tendrils swaying with emotion, and started walking deeper into the jungle. She didn't look back, but the tilt of her head and the way she gripped her bow made it clear she expected him to follow. He hesitated, weighing his options. He could run, try to lose her in the maze of trees and vines, but she moved like she owned this place, and he'd bet his last credit she'd track him down in minutes. Plus, his ship was out there somewhere, and if she knew this jungle, maybe she could lead him to it. With a sigh, he tucked the arrows into his belt and trudged after her, his boots sinking into the muddy ground. "Fine," he called, "but this better not take long." She led him through the undergrowth, her strides long and sure, weaving past thorns and roots like it was second nature. Tristan struggled to keep up, his human frame less suited to the tangled mess of Xythera's wilds. The air grew thicker the deeper they went, heavy with the scent of wet earth and something sharper, floral, maybe, but bitter too. After what felt like an hour, she stopped at the edge of a small clearing. A waterfall roared nearby, its mist shimmering in the dim light, and behind it, a cave yawned open, its mouth framed by jagged stone. Xythera ducked inside without a word, and Tristan followed, brushing water from his face as he stepped into the cool shadows. The cave was bigger than it looked, its walls studded with glowing stones that cast a soft blue light over everything. Shelves of rock held crude tools, bone knives, woven nets, and a pile of fur sat in one corner. Xythera dropped her bow against the wall and turned to face him, her arms crossed over her chest. The harness she wore shifted slightly, revealing more of that emerald skin, smooth and taut over muscle that looked carved from stone. Tristan caught himself staring and jerked his eyes up, only to meet hers, red, fierce, and unblinking. She spoke, her voice low and rough, and the wristband translated in fits and starts. "You burden. Slow. Weak." Tristan bristled, wiping blood from his hand onto his torn pants. "Weak, huh? I caught your arrows, didn't I? Twice. Maybe you're the one who needs to work on her aim." Her eyes flared, and for a second, he thought she'd lunge at him. Instead, she stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating off her, smell that strange, sharp scent clinging to her skin. Her tendrils twitched, brushing the air near his shoulder, and his pulse kicked up a notch. "I hunt Korgoth," she said, the wristband filling in. "Beast Danger Tribe. You slow me." She jabbed a claw at his chest, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to make him flinch. "Korgoth?" he echoed, frowning. "What's that? Some kind of animal?" She nodded, her expression darkening, and pointed out toward the jungle. "Big, strong, kill many. I must stop." The wristband stuttered, but he got the gist. Something out there was bad news, and she was on a mission to take it down. He leaned against the cave wall, crossing his arms to match her stance. "Okay, so you got a monster problem. What's it got to do with me?" Her tendrils flared, and she growled, a sound that vibrated through the stone floor. "KVYR," she snapped. "Elon, must protect." She gestured at him, then herself, her claws flexing like she wasn't sure whether to grab him or gut him. Tristan laughed, short and bitter. "Protect me? Lady, I've been dodging death since I was a kid. I don't need a babysitter." Her eyes narrowed, and she stepped even closer, her chest almost brushing his. He could see the scars on her face now, faint lines etched into her cheekbones, and the way her harness hugged her curves made his throat tighten. "Then help," she said, the wristband adding, "Hunt with me." He blinked, caught off guard. "Help you? Why would I do that?" She didn't back off, her breath warm against his face as she spoke again. "You want ship. I know jungle. Help me. I help you." Her voice was firm, but there was a flicker in her eyes, something like reluctance, maybe even desperation. Tristan ran a hand through his damp hair, thinking it over. He didn't trust her, not even a little, but she had a point. He was lost out here, and she wasn't. If she could get him to the Eclipse Runner, it might be worth playing along. "Fine," he said at last. "Deal. But once we're done, I'm gone. No more of this KVYR nonsense." She didn't respond, just turned and grabbed a bone spear from the wall, her movements sharp and precise. "Come," she said, heading back toward the cave entrance. "We move now." Tristan groaned but followed, his boots squelching in the wet moss as he stepped outside. The waterfall's roar filled his ears, and he squinted against the mist, watching her silhouette ahead. She moved like a predator, all grace and power, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just signed up for more than he could handle. Their first test came an hour later, as they trekked along a narrow path lined with towering ferns. Xythera stopped suddenly, her tendrils stiffening, and held up a hand. "Quiet," she hissed. Before Tristan could ask why, the ground trembled, a low, rhythmic thud that sent birds scattering from the trees. She dropped into a crouch, peering through the foliage, and he followed her lead, his dagger ready. "What is it?" he whispered. She didn't answer, just pointed ahead. Through the mist, he saw them. 3 creatures, smaller than whatever this Korgoth might be, but still nasty. They were lizard-like, with spiked tails and jaws dripping with yellow venom, skittering toward them on clawed feet. "Offspring," Xythera said, her voice tight. "Korgoths." The wristband confirmed. "Young, dangerous." Tristan cursed under his breath. "Great. Baby monsters." She shot him a glare, then gripped her spear tighter. "Fight," she ordered, and before he could argue, the first one lunged. Xythera moved like lightning, her spear slamming into its side, green blood spraying across the ferns. Tristan dodged as the second one snapped at his legs, swinging his dagger in a quick arc. The blade sank into its neck, and it screeched, thrashing before going still. The third came at Xythera from behind, but she spun, her tendrils whipping through the air, and drove her spear through its skull. Breathing hard, she straightened, wiping blood from her weapon. Tristan sheathed his dagger, his hands shaking slightly from the rush. "Not bad," he said, forcing a grin. "Guess I'm not so weak, huh?" She turned to him, her red eyes glinting, and stepped closer, too close. Her chest heaved from the fight, her harness slick with sweat and blood, and one of her tendrils brushed his arm, sending a jolt through him. "You live," she said, her voice low, almost a growl. "For now." The wristband didn't translate the rest, but the look in her eyes said plenty, grudging respect. Maybe mixed with something hotter, something dangerous. Tristan swallowed, his skin prickling, and looked away. This was going to be a long hunt. The jungle seemed to close in tighter after the fight, the air growing heavier with every step. Tristan wiped venom-slick blood from his dagger onto a fern, his heart still pounding from the skirmish. Xythera stood a few feet away, her spear planted in the ground, her emerald skin glistening with sweat and flecks of green gore. Her chest rose and fell in deep, steady breaths, the leather harness clinging to her like a second skin, outlining every curve and ridge of muscle. Those red eyes flicked to him, sharp and unreadable, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, thick with the buzz of insects and the distant roar of the waterfall, but underneath it, something else simmered, something neither of them wanted to name. "Good work back there," Tristan said finally, breaking the quiet. He kept his tone light, casual, like they hadn't just danced with death. "You're fast, real fast." She didn't smile, didn't even blink, just pulled her spear free and wiped the blade clean on a leaf. "You're not dead," she replied, her voice low and rough, the wristband humming. "Good enough." He snorted, shaking his head. "High praise. I'll take it." Her tendrils twitched, curling inward, and she turned away, starting down the path again. "Move," she ordered. "Korgith waits." Tristan fell into step behind her, his boots crunching over twigs and moss. The jungle pressed in on all sides now, the ferns brushing his arms, the vines dangling low enough to snag his torn jacket. He couldn't shake the image of her fighting. How she'd moved, all power and precision, her body bending and twisting like a weapon itself. It wasn't just skill, it was something primal, something that stirred a heat in his gut he didn't want to admit. He shoved the thought down, focusing on the ache in his hand where the arrow had cut him. "So this Korgith," he called after her, "how big are we talking? Bigger than those little bastards back there?" She didn't stop, but her voice carried back, clipped and firm. "Much bigger. Tall trees. Teeth sharp. Kill all." The wristband filled in the gaps. "Korgith destroy tribe." Tristan whistled low. "Sounds like a party. Why is it your job to take it down?" She slowed, just enough for him to catch up, and shot him a sidelong glance. "Father, leader. Dead. I must prove." Her tendrils flared briefly, then settled. "Krezer, take tribe. I take back." He pieced it together. Her dad was some kind of chief, she was next in line, and this Krezer guy had swooped in. Killing Korgith was her ticket to reclaiming her place. "Tough gig," he said. "But I get it. You've got something to prove." Her eyes flicked to him again, lingering this time, and he felt the weight of her stare like a physical touch. "You prove nothing," she said, the wristband adding, weak still. He grinned, stepping closer despite the jab. "Keep telling yourself that. I'm still here, aren't I?" She growled, a low rumble in her throat, and turned away, but not before he caught a flicker in her expression, something that wasn't just irritation. He filed it away, his grin widening. She might hate him, but she couldn't ignore him. Not anymore. They reached a shallow stream a short while later, its water dark and rippling under the canopy's gloom. Xythera stopped at the edge, kneeling to refill a hollowed-out gourd she carried. "Rest," she said, not looking at him. "Short." Tristan didn't argue. He dropped to one knee beside her, splashing water on his face and neck, the cold a sharp relief against the jungle's heat. His hand stung where the cut was, blood mixing with the stream in thin red swirls. He glanced at Xythera, watching as she unhooked her harness slightly, letting it hang loose to scoop water over her arms. The motion exposed more of her skin, smooth, glistening, the emerald hue deepening where it caught the light. A bead of water rolled down her neck, tracing a path over her collarbone and disappearing beneath the leather. His breath hitched, and he forced his eyes away, splashing more water on his own face. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself. She noticed. Of course she did. Her head snapped up, red eyes locking onto him, and a faint smirk, or what he thought might be a smirk, curved her lips. "Soft," she said, her voice almost a purr, the wristband translating skin weak. She reached over, her clawed fingers brushing his injured hand, and he froze. Her touch was light, testing, but it sent a jolt through him, sharp and electric. "Bleeds easy," she added, her gaze dropping to the cut, then back to his face. Her tendrils swayed closer, one brushing his wrist, cool and alive against his skin. His pulse raced, and he pulled his hand back, covering the reaction with a laugh. "Yeah, well, it's still attached. That's what counts." Xythera didn't pull away. She leaned in instead, her face inches from his, her breath warm and faintly sweet against his cheek. "You fight," she said slowly, the wristband humming. "Not useless." Her eyes searched his, red and burning, and for a moment he couldn't look away. The stream gurgled between them, the jungle fading to a dull roar, and all he could feel was the heat of her, the press of her presence. His throat tightened, a flush creeping up his neck, and he wondered, stupidly, what those tendrils would feel like wrapped around more than just his wrist. She lingered there, too long, too close, then stood abruptly, breaking the spell. "Enough," she snapped, slinging the gourd over her shoulder. "We go." Tristan stood, shaking off the daze, and followed her across the stream. His boots splashed through the water, soaking his pants, but he barely noticed. His mind was stuck on that moment. The way she'd looked at him, the way she'd touched him. It wasn't friendly, not even close, but it wasn't hostile either. It was something else, something that made his blood run hotter than the jungle ever could. He pushed it down, focusing on the path ahead, but the seed was planted, and he knew it. They walked in silence for a while, the terrain growing rougher, rocks jutting from the ground, vines thicker and more tangled. Xythera moved with the same relentless grace, her spear tapping the earth like a metronome. Tristan kept pace, his body aching, but his mind sharp. He needed her help, that much was clear, but he wasn't about to let her call all the shots. "So how do we kill this Korgoth thing?" he asked, breaking the quiet. "You got a plan, right?" She stopped, turning to face him fully, her tendrils fanning out like a crown. "Trap," she said, her voice steady. "Lure strike. You help or die." The wristband clarified. "Korgoth follows sound. We make noise." Tristan nodded, his mind already turning. "Noise, huh? I've got something from the ship. A motor still works. Could use that to draw it in." Her eyes narrowed, considering, then she gave a sharp nod. "Good. You're not useless yet." He grinned, stepping closer, close enough to feel that heat again. "Keep underestimating me," he said, his voice low. "See where it gets you." Her tendrils twitched, brushing his arm, and her lips parted slightly, showing a hint of fangs. She didn't reply, just turned and kept walking, but the air between them had shifted, charged, alive, and dangerously unsteady. The jungle seemed to hold its breath as Tristan and Xythera pushed deeper into its heart, the air growing denser with every step. The plan was simple, or as simple as baiting a monster the size of a skyscraper could be. They'd used the motor Tristan had salvaged from the Eclipse runner's wreckage, a vibrating hunk of metal he'd dragged back from a twisted heap of hull plating 2 days ago. It still hummed when powered up, loud enough to shake the ground, and if Xythera was right about Korgoth chasing sound, it might just work. The trick was getting it to a narrow gorge they'd scouted earlier, a bottleneck of rock and vine where they could trap the beast and bring it down. Simple didn't mean easy, though, and Tristan could feel the weight of it settling into his bones. They stopped at the gorge's edge, a jagged scar in the jungle floor flanked by steep, moss-slick walls that rose 30 feet high. The space between was tight, barely wide enough for 2 people to stand shoulder to shoulder, and the ground was littered with loose stones and tangled roots. Above, the canopy thinned, letting slivers of pale sunlight stab through the mist. Xythera knelt, running her clawed fingers over the dirt, her tendrils swaying as she studied the terrain. "Here," she said, her voice firm, the wristband humming. "Korgoth, come here." She pointed to a spot near the gorge's mouth, then traced a line deeper in. "Trap there." Tristan crouched beside her, setting the motor down with a grunt. It was heavy, 20 pounds of dented steel and frayed wiring, but it still sparked when he'd tested it. "All right," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "We set this up at the entrance, crank it loud, and lure that thing in. Then what? You planning to stab it to death with that spear?" He nodded at the bone weapon slung across her back, its tip gleaming wickedly in the dim light. She shot him a look, her red eyes glinting with something between annoyance and amusement. "No," she said, standing. "Rock fall. Crush." The wristband added, "Drop, stones kill." He nodded, glancing up at the gorge walls. They were unstable, chunks of stone already loose and teetering, held together by vines and time. "Smart," he said. "We rigged the motor to draw it in, then knock those down on its head. Could work." He paused, meeting her gaze. "If we don't get squashed first." Her lips twitched, almost a smirk, and she stepped closer, her shadow falling over him. "You fear?" she asked, her voice low, the wristband translating weak now. Her tendrils brushed the air near his face, cool and alive, and he felt a shiver crawl up his spine. "Fears for people who don't know what they're doing," he shot back, standing to match her height, though he still had to tilt his head up. "I've handled worse than this." It was a half-lie. He'd faced plenty of ugly things, but nothing like what she described. A beast taller than the trees, with teeth that could shred metal. Still, he held her stare, his pulse kicking up as she loomed closer, her chest nearly brushing his. Her harness was streaked with dirt now, clinging tighter from the day's sweat, and a bead of moisture rolled down her neck, catching the light on its way to her collarbone. He swallowed hard, forcing his eyes back to hers. "You sure you can handle it?" Her tendrils flared, one grazing his arm, and she leaned in, her breath hot against his ear. "I hunt always," she murmured, the wristband buzzing. "You watch." The words were a challenge, but the way she lingered, too close, too warm, felt like something else. His skin prickled, heat pooling low in his gut, and he stepped back, breaking the moment. "Yeah, well, let's get this thing set up before we're dinner," he said, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. She straightened, her eyes still locked on him, then turned to the motor without another word. They worked fast, dragging the motor into position at the gorge's mouth. Tristan rigged it with a power cell he'd scavenged, twisting wires until it sputtered to life, its hum vibrating through the ground like a heartbeat. Xythera climbed the walls with eerie grace, her claws digging into cracks as she wedged vines and stones into place, setting up a crude avalanche waiting to drop. He watched her move, muscles flexing under that emerald skin, her body bending and stretching with every reach, and caught himself staring again. "Focus," he muttered, shaking his head as he tightened the last connection. She dropped back down beside him, landing silently, and they tested the setup. He flipped the motor on, and it roared a deep, grinding noise that echoed off the gorge walls. The ground shook, pebbles rattling loose, and Xythera nodded sharply. "Good," she said, switching it off. "Korgith, here come." She grabbed her spear, her tendrils coiling tight, and started toward the deeper end of the gorge. "We wait there." Tristan grabbed the motor's remote, a jury-rigged switch he'd slapped together, and followed, his boots crunching over the uneven ground. They reached the trap point, a wider spot where the walls curved inward, the loose stones above casting long shadows. Xythera pointed up. "You climb," she said. "Dropping, I say." He frowned, eyeing the slick rock. "And you?" She tapped her spear against the ground. "I lure strike." The wristband clarified. "Bring. Korgith here." Tristan's stomach tightened. "Your bait? That's insane." She stepped closer, her red eyes boring into him, and her voice dropped low. "I warrior. You not." Her tendrils brushed his chest, light but deliberate, and his breath caught, the air between them thickening. "You're crazy," he said, but there was no heat in it. She was close now, too close, her heat seeping into him, her scent sharp and wild. He could feel the press of her presence, the way her harness hugged her curves, and his hands itched to move, to touch, but he clenched them instead. "Just don't get yourself killed," he added, stepping back. "I'd hate to drag that motor back alone." Her lips parted, showing a hint of fangs, and she turned away, her tendrils swaying like they were laughing at him. "Climb," she ordered, and he did, scrambling up the wall with less grace than she'd shown, finding a perch near the top. He settled in, the remote clutched tight, and watched her below. She moved to the center of the gorge, spear in hand, her stance wide and ready. The jungle was quiet now, too quiet, the usual chirps and rustles gone. Tristan's pulse thudded in his ears, his eyes fixed on her. On the way she stood, all power and defiance, like she could take on the world. Then it came, a tremor, faint at first, then stronger, shaking the stones beneath him. Xythera tensed, her tendrils fanning out, and he flipped the motor on. The roar erupted, bouncing off the walls, and the ground quaked harder. "Here we go," he muttered, gripping the rock. The trees ahead parted with a crash, and Korgith emerged. It was massive, taller than the tallest trees, its body a nightmare of scales and spines, segmented like a centipede but thicker, heavier. Its head was a wedge of bone and teeth, jaws snapping with a sound like breaking steel, and its legs, hundreds of them, clawed the earth, tearing roots apart. Tristan's mouth went dry. "Holy," he started, but Xythera was already moving, shouting something sharp in her language, her spear raised. The beast's eyes, black, gleaming, locked onto her, and it charged, the ground shaking with every step. She darted forward, her body a blur, leading it toward the gorge. Tristan's heart slammed against his ribs as he watched her dance with death, her spear flashing as she stabbed at its legs, green blood spraying. Korgith roared, a sound that rattled his bones, and swung its head, missing her by inches. She rolled, coming up fast, and kept running, drawing it in. "Come on," he whispered, his finger hovering over the remote. The beast hit the gorge's mouth, its bulk barely fitting, and Xythera sprinted deeper, her voice echoing. "Now!" Tristan triggered the motor full blast, the noise deafening, and Korgith surged forward, its jaws snapping at her heels. She reached the trap point, spinning to face it, and he saw the moment. Her eyes flicked up to him, red and fierce, trusting him to drop the stones. He yanked at the vines they'd rigged, his muscles straining, and the first rocks tumbled, crashing toward the beast below. The rocks fell like thunder, a cascade of stone and dust roaring down the gorge walls. Tristan yanked harder on the vines, his arms burning as he dislodged chunk after chunk, aiming for Korgith's massive, thrashing form below. The beast bellowed, its segmented body rearing up, jaws snapping at the air as the first boulders crashed into its back. Green blood sprayed, splattering the gorge floor, and for a heartbeat, Tristan thought they'd done it, thought the trap would hold. Xythera stood her ground beneath, her spear flashing as she stabbed at its underbelly, her emerald skin streaked with dirt and gore. Her tendrils whipped wildly, her red eyes blazing with defiance as she dodged a swipe from its clawed legs. "Come on, you bastard," Tristan growled, heaving another stone free. It slammed into Korgith's flank, cracking a plate of its armored hide, but the beast didn't stop. It twisted, faster than something that size should have been, and slammed its head into the gorge wall. The impact shook the entire structure, sending a spiderweb of cracks racing up toward Tristan's perch. "Shit!" he shouted, gripping the rock as it shuddered beneath him. More stones broke loose, too many, too fast, and the trap they'd so carefully set started to turn against them. The gorge was collapsing, not just on Korgith, but on everything. Xythera saw it too. She darted back, her spear slashing at the beast's legs to keep it pinned, but the falling rocks were closing off her escape. "Move!" Tristan yelled, his voice raw over the motor's dying whine. It had sputtered out under a pile of debris, its job done. She didn't look up, didn't flinch, just kept fighting, her body a blur of motion as she drove Korgith deeper into the trap. A boulder the size of a hoverbike tumbled past her, missing by inches, and Tristan's stomach lurched. She was good, damn good, but she wasn't invincible, and he wasn't about to watch her get crushed because of some insane warrior pride. He didn't think, just acted. Sliding down the crumbling wall, he hit the gorge floor hard, his boots skidding in the mud and blood. Korgoth roared, its jaws swinging towards Xythera, and she ducked, rolling under its belly to stab upward again. Green ichor gushed, soaking her harness, but the beast barely slowed. Tristan sprinted toward her, dodging a falling rock that shattered where he'd stood a second ago. "Xythera," he shouted, grabbing her arm mid-strike. Her skin was slick, warm under his grip, and she spun on him, her red eyes wide with fury. "What you do?" she snarled, the wristband crackling. "Fight, not run." "We're dead if we stay," he snapped, yanking her back as another slab of stone crashed down, clipping Korgoth's tail. The beast shrieked, thrashing harder, and the gorge walls groaned, more cracks splitting the rock. She resisted, her claws digging into his wrist, but he didn't let go. "Trust me," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Her tendrils flared, her chest heaving, and for a split second, their eyes locked, his desperate, hers burning. Then she nodded, sharp and quick, and they ran. They bolted deeper into the gorge, the only way left, as the trap collapsed behind them. Korgoth lunged, its jaws snapping at their heels, but the falling rocks were doing their work now, piling up, pinning its lower half. Tristan spotted a narrow crevice ahead, a slit in the wall barely wide enough to squeeze through. "There!" he yelled, shoving Xythera toward it. She dove in first, her body twisting with that eerie grace, and he followed, scraping his shoulders raw as he forced himself through. The crevice was tight, dark, the air thick with dust and the smell of crushed stone. Korgoth's roar echoed behind them, muffled but furious, as the gorge sealed shut with a final, earth-shaking crash. They stumbled into a small hollow, a pocket of space carved out by the rockfall, and collapsed against the walls, panting. Dust coated everything. Tristan's hair, Xythera's skin, the air itself, turning the faint glow of a single luminescent stone into a hazy blur. His chest burned, his legs screamed, but they were alive. He glanced at her, sprawled across from him, her spear still clutched in one hand. Her harness was torn now, one strap hanging loose, exposing a stretch of emerald skin streaked with blood. Hers or Korgoth's, he couldn't tell. Her tendrils hung limp, matted with grime, but her red eyes glowed through the gloom, fixed on him. "You stupid," she rasped, her voice hoarse, the wristband buzzing. "Risk all." He laughed, a ragged sound that hurt his throat. "Yeah, well, you're welcome." She didn't laugh, didn't even smile, just pushed off the wall and crawled toward him, closing the tiny space between them. His breath caught as she loomed over him, her knees bracketing his hips, her hands slamming into the rock on either side of his head. "You saved me," she said low and deliberate, the wristband translating why. Her tendrils brushed his face, cool and trembling, and he felt the heat of her thighs pressing against his, her chest inches from his, her breath hot on his lips. His heart slammed against his ribs, every nerve lighting up. "Because I'm not losing you to that thing," he said, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. "Not after all this." Her eyes searched his, red and fierce, and something shifted, something raw, unguarded. She leaned closer, her lips parting, fangs glinting, and for a dizzying moment, he thought she'd close the gap. His hands twitched, aching to grab her, to pull her in, but she stopped, just short, her breath mingling with his, her tendrils curling around his neck like a tease. "Kavyr," she murmured, the words soft, heavy, and then she pulled back, leaving him cold and reeling. Before he could process it, a faint scratching echoed through the hollow, Korgoth still alive, clawing at the rocks trapping it. Xythera snapped upright, grabbing her spear, her tendrils flaring. "Not dead," she said, the wristband confirming. "Finish now." Tristan scrambled up, his body protesting, and nodded. "Let's end it." They squeezed back through the crevice, emerging into the gorge, or what was left of it. The walls had caved in, burying half of Korgoth under a mountain of stone, but its head and upper body thrashed free, jaws snapping, eyes black with rage. Xythera charged first, her spear aimed at its face, and Tristan followed, snagging a jagged rock as his weapon. She leapt, landing on its snout, driving the spear deep into one eye. The beast shrieked, bucking wildly, and Tristan swung his rock, smashing it into the other eye with all the strength he had left. Blood gushed, thick and green, and Korgitha's thrashing slowed, its roars fading to gurgles. Xythera yanked her spear free, plunging it again and again, until the beast went still, its massive form slumping into the rubble. They stood there, panting, surrounded by dust and destruction. The gorge was a ruin, the trap a success, barely. Tristan dropped the rock, his hands shaking, and turned to Xythera. She was a mess, blood-soaked, battered, her harness hanging by threads. But she stood tall, spear planted in the ground, her red eyes blazing with triumph. "Korgith dead," she said, the wristband humming. "We win." He grinned, exhausted but alive. "Yeah, we did." She stepped closer, her tendrils brushing his arm, her gaze locking onto his. "You strong," she said, her voice low, the wristband adding, "not weak." It was the closest thing to praise he'd gotten from her, and it hit harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to reply, but she turned away, scanning the wreckage. "Tribe must know," she said. "We go back." Tristan nodded, his mind still spinning from the fight, and from her. They'd killed Korgith, but the cost was high. The gorge was gone, their proof buried. Getting her people to believe them would be the next battle, and he had a feeling it wouldn't be easy. The trek back to the VYXRA tribe felt longer than it should have, every step heavier under the weight of exhaustion and triumph. The jungle was quieter now, as if Korgitha's death had silenced its darker corners, but the air still clung to Tristan like a damp shroud, thick with humidity and the faint tang of blood. His clothes hung in tatters, soaked with sweat and streaked with green ichor from the fight. His hands ached, one sliced from the arrow, the other bruised from smashing rocks into Korgitha's skull. But he kept moving, his boots crunching over moss and roots. Beside him, Xythera strode with purpose, her spear resting on her shoulder, its tip still wet with the beast's blood. Her emerald skin glistened under the faint light breaking through the canopy, her torn harness barely holding together, exposing more of her muscled frame than before. Her tendrils swayed with each step, matted with dust, but alive, curling faintly as if tasting the air. They didn't talk much. Words felt unnecessary after what they'd just survived. Korgitha's roars, the collapsing gorge, that breathless moment in the hollow when her body had pressed so close to his he'd nearly lost himself. Tristan's mind kept circling back to it. Her heat, her breath, the way her red eyes had burned into him. He shook it off, focusing on the path ahead, but the memory lingered, a low simmer in his gut he couldn't quite ignore. Xythera seemed oblivious, her gaze fixed forward, but every now and then her tendrils brushed his arm, light and fleeting, and he wondered if she felt it too. The tribe's settlement emerged as the trees thinned, a sprawling network of platforms and huts woven into the jungle's upper reaches. Rope bridges swayed between massive trunks, their bark studded with glowing stones that cast a soft blue haze over everything. Figures moved above, tall, green-skinned VYXRA with tendrils like Xythera's, their voices a low hum of clicks and growls. As Tristan and Xythera approached, heads turned, eyes narrowing at the sight of them, battered, bloody, and reeking of battle. A group of warriors dropped from the platforms, landing with fluid grace, their spears leveled. Their tendrils flared, and one barked something sharp, the wristband translating in fragments. "Xythera, outsider." "Why?" Xythera stepped forward, her chin high, her voice cutting through the murmur. "Korgith dead," she said, slamming her spear into the ground. The wristband buzzed. "We kill beast." The warriors hesitated, their red eyes flicking between her and Tristan, suspicion etched into their scarred faces. He shifted, his hand resting on his dagger, ready for trouble. "Tell them," he muttered, nudging her. "They don't look convinced." She shot him a glare, but raised her voice again, gesturing to the spear's bloodied tip. "Proof here. Korgith no more." Before the warriors could respond, a shadow fell over the clearing. A massive figure descended from the highest platform, landing with a thud that shook the earth. He was bigger than Xythera, nearly 8 feet, his skin a darker, mottled green, his tendrils thick and coiled like ropes. His chest was bare, scarred with deep, deliberate cuts, and a bone axe hung from his belt, its edge chipped but deadly. His red eyes glowed with menace as he straightened, towering over them all. "Krezer," Xythera hissed, her tendrils stiffening, the wristband silent. She didn't need it for that name. Krezer's gaze swept over them, lingering on Tristan with open contempt. He spoke, his voice a deep rumble, the wristband catching. "Lies. Xythera, traitor. Outsider filth." The warriors shifted, their spears tilting toward Tristan, and he tensed, his grip tightening on his dagger. "Easy," he said, keeping his tone light despite the adrenaline spiking through him. "I'm just here to help." Krezer ignored him, stepping closer to Xythera, his tendrils flaring wide. "You run fail. Korgith lives. Tribe, mine." The wristband added, "Prove or die." Xythera's eyes blazed, her claws flexing. "Korgith buried gorge. We kill," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut stone. "You coward hide." The accusation hung in the air, and a murmur rippled through the warriors, some lowering their spears, others glancing at Krezer. He growled, a sound that vibrated through the ground, and pointed at Tristan. "This thing defile. Vyxra. Kvyr shame." The wristband buzzed. "Outsider taint honor." Tristan bristled, stepping forward. "Shame? I just help her take down your monster. Where were you?" Krezer's tendrils lashed out, stopping inches from Tristan's face, and the warriors tightened their grip on their weapons. Xythera moved faster, planting herself between them, her spear angled at Krezer's chest. "Kvyr," she said, her voice deadly calm, the wristband translating. "Mine, ritual. Touch him, fight me." The standoff held, the air thick with tension, until Krezer stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "Prove," he said again, turning to the warriors. "Korgith lives until seen." Xythera, liar, sacrifice, outsider, appease gods. Tristan's stomach sank. "Sacrifice?" he muttered, glancing at Xythera. "What's he talking about?" She didn't answer, her tendrils coiling tight, her gaze locked on Krezer. The warriors moved then, swift and coordinated, surrounding them. Ropes dropped from above, and before Tristan could draw his dagger, they were on him, claws grabbing his arms, binding his wrists with vine cords. Xythera fought back, her spear slashing, but a net fell from the platforms, tangling her legs. She roared, thrashing, but more warriors piled on, pinning her down. "Stop!" Tristan shouted, twisting against the ropes, but a claw slammed into his gut, doubling him over. They were dragged to a cage, a woven lattice of branches suspended high above the settlement, swaying on thick ropes. The warriors shoved them inside, slamming the bars shut, and left them dangling, the jungle floor a dizzying drop below. Tristan caught his breath, his ribs aching, and turned to Xythera. She was on her knees, her harness ripped further, one strap dangling loose to reveal a stretch of emerald skin across her shoulder. Her tendrils hung limp, her spear gone, but her red eyes burned with fury. "Krezer, liar," she spat, the wristband buzzing. "Steel tribe, kill us." "Yeah, I got that," Tristan said, testing the ropes around his wrists. They were tight, cutting into his skin, but he twisted anyway, searching for a weak spot. "What's this sacrifice bullshit?" She shifted closer, her knees brushing his, and the cage rocked slightly. "Krezer, say God's angry. Korgith, alive, punish tribe. You die to calm them." The wristband stuttered, "Outsider, blood offering." He laughed, short and bitter. "Great, so I'm the scapegoat. And you?" She met his gaze, her tendrils twitching. "I fight him. Lose honor. He kill me too." The words were flat, but her eyes flickered. Anger, yes, but something deeper, something raw. Tristan stopped tugging at the ropes, his hands falling still. "Not happening," he said, his voice low. We didn't kill that thing just to let this bastard win. She leaned closer, her breath warm against his face, and the cage's tight space forced their bodies together, her thigh pressing into his, her chest grazing his arm. "You believe me?" she asked, the wristband humming. "Trust now." He held her stare, his pulse racing, not just from the danger, but from the way she filled the space, fierce and unyielding. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "I trust you, but we're getting out of this." Her tendrils brushed his cheek, cool and trembling, and she didn't pull away. "Ow," she murmured, her lips so close he could feel the heat of them. His hands twitched, the ropes biting deeper, and he fought the urge to lean in to close that gap. "I've got a trick or two," he said instead, forcing a grin. "Just need my dagger." She shifted, her body sliding against his, and reached into her harness with a clawed hand, pulling out his dagger, snatched from the warriors in the scuffle. "This?" she asked, her voice low, teasing, the wristband silent. His grin widened, real this time. "You're full of surprises." She pressed it into his bound hands, her fingers lingering on his, and the cage rocked again, the tension between them coiling tighter than the ropes. "Cut," she said, her red eyes locked on his. "Fust." Tristan's fingers closed around the dagger, the cold metal a lifeline in his bound hands. Xylara's touch lingered for a heartbeat longer, her claws brushing his knuckles, and the cage swayed as their combined weight shifted. The space was suffocating, her thigh pressed hard against his, her emerald skin warm through the thin gap where her harness had torn, her tendrils curling near his face like they were alive with her intensity. Her red eyes held his, fierce and unyielding, and the air between them crackled, thick with something neither dared name. "Cut," she repeated, her voice a low growl, the wristband silent but unnecessary. He knew what she meant. He nodded, twisting the blade awkwardly behind his back, feeling for the vines binding his wrists. The ropes were tough, woven tight from jungle fibers, but the dagger's edge was sharper. He sawed carefully, his shoulders aching, the cage rocking with every move. Xythera stayed close, her body shielding his hands from view if anyone glanced up from below. Her breath grazed his neck, hot and steady, and he gritted his teeth, forcing his focus onto the task instead of the way her presence lit every nerve on fire. "Almost there," he muttered, feeling the first strands give way. She didn't reply, just shifted her weight, her knees sliding higher against his thigh, and he bit back a curse as the cage tilted, the ropes creaking above them. A snap, soft, muffled, and his hands broke free. He flexed his fingers, blood rushing back into them, and handed the dagger to her. "Your turn." She took it, her claws brushing his palm, and sliced through her own bonds with a single, precise cut. The vines fell away, and she tucked the blade back in her harness, her tendrils coiling tight with purpose. "Now," she said, her voice steady, the wristband buzzing out, "fight." Tristan nodded, scanning the cage. The bars were thick, but the weave had gaps, small but maybe enough. He pointed to a spot near the bottom. "There." We squeezed through, dropped to the platform below. She followed his gaze, then moved, her body pressing against his as she tested the opening. Her shoulders slid past his chest, her tendrils grazing his jaw, and he held his breath, fighting the heat surging through him. She pushed through first, her frame twisting with that predator's grace, and slipped out, landing silently on the platform 10 feet below. Tristan followed, less elegant, scraping his arms raw as he wriggled free. He hit the wood with a thud, rolling to his feet beside her. The settlement hummed around them, warriors patrolling above, voices drifting from the huts, but no one had spotted them yet. "Move," Xythera whispered, darting toward a rope bridge, and he kept pace, his heart pounding. They reached the central platform, a wide circle ringed with glowing stones, where Krezer stood addressing the tribe. His massive form loomed over a crowd of VYXRA, his bone axe raised, his voice a rumble of authority. "Xythera, weak fail. Korgith curse us. Outsider, blood save," he bellowed, the wristband translating in fragments. The warriors cheered, tendrils flaring, and Tristan's gut twisted. He's got them hooked, he muttered. Zalara's eyes narrowed, her claws flexing. No more, she said, stepping forward, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Krezer, liar. The crowd stilled, heads turning as she strode into the open, Tristan at her side. Krezer spun, his tendrils lashing out, his red eyes blazing with rage. You dare? He roared, the wristband buzzing. Cage, not hold. Zalara planted herself in front of him, her torn harness hanging defiantly, her skin streaked with the marks of battle. Korgith dead, she snapped, her voice ringing out. I kill with Kaviwire. You hide steal. The wristband clarified, prove coward. Krezer's axe swung up, but Tristan stepped forward, his voice loud and steady. She's not lying. I was there, gorge collapsed, Korgith is buried under it. We risked everything while you sat here playing king. The warriors murmured, some lowering their spears, doubt creeping into their faces. Krezer growled, his tendrils whipping toward Tristan, but Zalara intercepted, grabbing his arm with a snarl. Mine, she said, her voice deadly, the wristband humming. Kaviwire, honor. The crowd shifted, torn between them, and Krezer's patience snapped. Fight, he bellowed, wrenching free and swinging his axe. Zalara dodged, rolling low, and snatched a spear from a nearby warrior. The clash was instant, steel on bone, sparks flying as she parried, her tendrils flaring with every strike. Tristan darted to the side, scanning for an opening. Krezer was bigger, stronger, but slow, his rage making him sloppy. Zalara ducked a wild swing, her spear slashing his leg, green blood welling up. He roared, lunging, and she stumbled, the axe grazing her shoulder. Now, she shouted, her eyes flicking to Tristan. He didn't hesitate. Grabbing a handful of dirt from the platform, he hurled it into Krezer's face, blinding him. The giant staggered, clawing at his eyes, and Zalara struck, her spear driving deep into his chest. Green blood sprayed, staining the wood, and Krezer's roar choked off into a gurgle. He swayed, his axe clattering to the ground, then collapsed, his tendrils twitching once before going still. Silence fell, heavy and absolute, broken only by Zalara's ragged breathing. She straightened, blood dripping from her shoulder, and turned to the tribe. Korgith dead, she said, her voice firm, the wristband translating a lead now. The warriors stared, then one by one, they dropped to a knee, tendrils lowering in submission. Tristan stepped up beside her, his chest heaving, his hands still trembling from the fight. Guess they believe you now, he said, forcing a grin. She looked at him, her red eyes softening, just a flicker but enough. You fight well, she said, the wristband adding, Kaviwire strong. The tribe parted as she moved forward, reclaiming her place, and Tristan followed, his mind racing. They'd won. Korgith was gone, Krezer was dead, and she was in charge. But the cost hung over them. The gorge's collapse meant no body to show, and Krezer's lies had sown seeds of doubt. The warriors accepted her now, but he wondered how long that would last. Zalara stopped at the platform's edge, her tendrils brushing his arm, and he felt it again, that pull, that heat. Stay, she said, her voice low, the wristband silent. He met her gaze, his throat tight. For now, he replied, knowing they weren't done. Not with the jungle, not with each other. The VYXRA settlement buzzed with new life in the days after Krezer's fall. The warriors moved with purpose, repairing platforms, sharpening spears, their tendrils swaying in rhythm with their tasks. Zalara stood at the heart of it all, her presence a quiet command, her red eyes scanning the tribe she'd reclaimed. The gash on her shoulder was bandaged now, wrapped in woven leaves, but she bore it like a badge, her torn harness replaced with a fresh one. Still leather, still tight, hugging her emerald frame with the same fierce grace. Tristan watched her from the edge of the central platform, leaning against a tree trunk, his arms crossed. His own wounds, cuts, bruises, the ache in his ribs, were healing, patched up with whatever the VYXRA used for medicine, a bitter paste that stung like hell, but worked fast. He'd survived Xythera, Korgith, Krezer, and somehow he'd come out the other side with a story no one back home would believe. But he couldn't stay. The Eclipse Runner, or what was left of it, had been found, scattered across a swath of jungle a mile from the gorge. The tribe had helped him salvage it, dragging twisted metal and cracked circuits back to the settlement under Zalara's orders. He'd spent hours piecing it together, his hands black with grease, rewiring what he could with tools borrowed from the VYXRA. Bone and stone, crude but effective. The ship wasn't pretty anymore, its hull patched with vines and sap to seal the gaps. But it hummed when he fired it up, the engine coughing to life with a stubborn growl. It would fly, just far enough to get him off this rock and back to the Vera system, where he could cash in on the next job and forget this whole mess. That was the plan, anyway. So why did the thought of leaving twist his gut tighter than the crash ever had? He glanced at Xythera again, catching her mid-conversation with a warrior, her tendrils flaring as she gestured sharply. She'd changed since the fight, still fierce, still unyielding, but there was a weight to her now, a steadiness that hadn't been there before. She'd won her tribe back, proved her strength, and he'd been part of it. Her KVYR, bound by that damn ritual he'd stumbled into. He rubbed the spot on his hand where the arrow had cut him, the scar already forming, a faint white line against his skin. It was a mark, a memory, and he wasn't sure he wanted to let it go. She finished her orders and turned, her eyes finding his across the platform. The warrior beside her stepped away, leaving them alone in the crowd, and she walked toward him, her strides long and deliberate. The glowing stones cast shadows over her face, highlighting the scars on her cheekbones, the curve of her jaw. Her tendrils swayed, brushing her shoulders, and his pulse kicked up, a familiar heat stirring as she closed the distance. "Ship, ready?" she asked, stopping a foot away, her voice low, the wristband buzzing. "You go soon?" He nodded, uncrossing his arms. "Yeah, engines holding, hulls patched. Should get me out of here by tomorrow." Her tendrils stilled, her red eyes searching his, and for a moment, she didn't speak. The jungle hummed around them. Chirps, rustles, the creak of rope bridges, but it faded, drowned by the weight of her gaze. "Tomorrow," she repeated, the word heavy, the wristband silent. She stepped closer, her chest nearly brushing his, and he felt it again. That pull, that fire that had sparked in the gorge, in the cage, every time she'd come too near. "You leave?" "KVYR," she said, her voice softer now, the wristband humming. "Bond break?" He swallowed, his throat tight. "Doesn't work that way, does it? You said it's forever." Her lips parted, showing a hint of fangs, and her tendrils moved, one curling toward his arm, stopping just short. "Forever," she echoed, her eyes flickering. Anger, maybe, or something deeper, something that mirrored the ache in his chest. "You go. I stay." The wristband buzzed. "Tribe mine now." He nodded, forcing a grin he didn't feel. "Yeah, you've got this place handled. Me? I've got deals to chase, credits to make. Can't sit still too long." It sounded hollow, even to him, and her tendrils twitched like she heard it too. She stepped back, turning toward the platform's edge, and he thought that was it. Thought she'd walk away, let him go without another word. But she stopped, her back to him, and spoke over her shoulder. "Come," she said, her voice firm, the wristband silent. He frowned, then followed, his boots thumping on the wood as she led him down a winding path, away from the settlement. The trees closed in, the glow of the stones fading, until they reached a quiet clearing by a stream. The water glinted under the canopy's broken light, its surface rippling with the breeze, and she stopped there, facing him fully. "Xythera," he started, but she cut him off, stepping close, too close, her hands slamming into his chest, pinning him against a tree. Her tendrils flared, curling around his shoulders, brushing his neck, and he froze, his breath catching as her heat flooded him. "KVYR blood," she said, her voice low and fierce, the wristband buzzing. "Oath mine." Her claws dug into his jacket, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to hold him there, and her red eyes burned into his, raw and unguarded. "You leave, but call." "Cool me." The wristband stuttered. "Bond, and..." His hands moved before he could stop them, grabbing her wrists, feeling the strength beneath her skin. "You're serious," he said, his voice rough, his pulse racing. "You'd cross stars for this." She leaned in, her lips inches from his, her breath hot and wild. "Yes," she murmured, her tendrils sliding up his neck, cool and alive, sending shivers down his spine. "You mine always." The words hit hard, and he couldn't fight it anymore. The heat, the pull, the way she filled every space he'd tried to keep empty. He pulled her closer, his hands sliding to her waist, and kissed her. It was short, fierce, a clash of need and farewell. Her lips were warm, softer than he'd expected, her fangs grazing his mouth as she pressed back, her tendrils tightening around him. Her body molded to his, all muscle and fire, and he felt her claws dig into his shoulders, a sharp edge to the heat that made his blood sing. She pulled back first, her chest heaving, her red eyes glowing with something he couldn't name: pride, longing, promise. "Go," she said, stepping away, her tendrils falling limp. "But take this." She pressed something into his hand, the first arrow he'd caught, its metal warm from her grip. He stared at it, then at her, his throat tight. "I'll call," he said, his voice low, a vow he hadn't planned to make. "If I need you." She nodded, her tendrils curling once, then turned, walking back toward the settlement without looking back. He watched her go, the arrow heavy in his hand, until she vanished into the trees. The next morning, he stood by the Eclipse Runner, its patched hull gleaming dully under Xythera's misty sky. The tribe gathered at a distance, their tendrils swaying, Xythera at the front. She didn't approach, just watched, her red eyes fixed on him as he climbed aboard. The engine roared to life, shaking the ground, and he lifted off, the jungle shrinking below, trees, platforms, her figure standing tall among them. He gripped the arrow, its weighted tether, and as the ship broke through the atmosphere, he felt it, a thread stretching across the stars, unbroken, alive. Tristan Varkes had come to Xythera a lone hunter, a man running from nothing and chasing everything. He left with more, a mark on a tribe, a bond with a warrior, a proof of what humans could do. He'd survived, fought, and changed something bigger than himself. And out there, Xythera carried that too. The galaxy was wide, but it wasn't empty anymore. Not for him, not with her waiting, a promise etched in blood and steel.